The car didn't look real at first, not the way it sat there tilted into the black water like something abandoned by the world itself, headlights flickering beneath the surface, barely alive, barely holding on, and for a moment, just a moment, Daniel Hale thought it was already over, just another wreck claimed by the storm, another thing lost to a river that had swallowed more than it should have over the past 3 days. But then the sound came again, cutting through the rain, sharp and raw and impossibly alive, a bark, and in that instant, something deep inside a man who had spent years trying not to feel anything at all, woke up. The storm had broken the region in ways most people wouldn't understand unless they had seen it with their own eyes, trees ripped from the ground like they meant nothing, roads erased beneath mud and water, entire sections of forest reshaped into something unrecognizable, and the river, once quiet, predictable, had turned into something else entirely, something violent, something that didn't just flow, but hunted. Daniel had been driving back from the outer ridge when he saw it. Didn't expect anything. Didn't want anything. That had been his life for a long time now, simple, quiet, controlled. Because control was the only thing he had left. Retired Navy SEAL. People said it like it meant something clean, something finished. But Daniel knew better. You don't finish that life. You just step away from it, and carry the rest with you. Always. The rain hit the windshield in a steady rhythm, the kind that blurred everything just enough to make the world feel distant, detached, like you were watching it instead of being part of it, and Daniel had been fine with that. Detached was safe. Detached meant you didn't have to remember. Didn't have to feel. Didn't have to go back to the moments that never really left you. But then the shape appeared through the rain. Wrong. Out of place. A car, half submerged at the edge of the river. And everything changed. Daniel's foot hit the brake before his mind caught up, the tires slipping slightly in the mud as the vehicle came to a hard stop, his hands tightening on the wheel, his eyes locked forward, trying to understand what he was seeing. The river was too high. Too fast. No one should have been anywhere near it. Not after the storm. Not after the warnings. Which meant one of two things. Someone made a mistake. Or someone didn't get a choice. He stared at it for a second longer than he should have. Because hesitation was something he had trained out of himself years ago. But this wasn't a mission. This wasn't war. This was different. Or at least, it was supposed to be. Then he heard it. A bark. Faint. Broken. But real. Daniel's jaw tightened. And just like that, the decision was made. The door flew open. Cold air slammed into him instantly, sharp and biting, carrying the scent of wet earth, river water, and something metallic underneath it all, something that didn't belong in a place like this. He moved fast. Boots hitting the ground. Mud shifting under his weight. The rain soaking through his jacket almost instantly. The world narrowing down to one thing. That car. Another bark. Louder this time. Strained. Daniel's pace increased. The slope toward the riverbank was unstable, the ground torn apart by the storm, and he nearly lost his footing halfway down, catching himself on instinct, his body reacting before thought, before fear, before anything else. Because that part of him never went away. The part that moved when others froze. The part that acted when time ran out. The water hit him like a shock. Cold. Violent. Alive. It surged around his legs immediately, pushing hard, testing his balance, trying to pull him sideways, but he adjusted, planted his feet, leaned into it, the same way he had learned to move against forces that didn't care whether you survived or not. The car was worse up close. Much worse. The front end was already gone beneath the surface, the hood invisible, the windshield cracked and dark, water pushing in through every opening, every weakness, every space it could find. The rear was still above water, barely. The trunk tilted upward, one wheel spinning slowly, uselessly, like the last movement of something that hadn't accepted its end yet. And then Daniel saw it. Inside. Movement. The German Shepherd. Trapped in the back seat. The water had already filled half the interior, sloshing violently with the current, rising inch by inch, second by second, and the dog was holding on. Front paws braced against the door. Body pressed tight against the seat. Head lifted just above the waterline. Eyes locked directly onto Daniel. Not wild. Not panicked. Focused. Aware. Fighting. Daniel felt something hit him in that moment. Not fear. Not hesitation. Something else. Recognition. Because he had seen that look before. In men. In places where survival wasn't guaranteed. Where giving up was easier. But wasn't an option. Hold on, he said under his breath, though the river swallowed most of the sound before it could carry. The dog didn't move. Didn't bark again. It just watched him. Waiting. Trusting, in a way that didn't make sense. Daniel moved around the vehicle quickly, the current pushing harder now as more of the car slipped under, the angle shifting slightly, dangerously, every movement of the water bringing it closer to disappearing completely. He grabbed the rear door handle. Pulled. Nothing. The frame had warped. Crushed just enough to lock it in place. He pulled again. Harder. Still nothing. The water surged higher. The dog adjusted, lifting its head further, but there wasn't much room left now. Seconds. That's all this was. Seconds. Daniel stepped back slightly, his mind moving fast, scanning, calculating. Door was out. That left one option. Glass. He reached to his belt, pulling free the compact rescue tool he always carried, even now, even after everything, because habits like that didn't disappear, they stayed, buried just under the surface, waiting for a moment like this. The moment his hand closed around it, something shifted. A memory. Another vehicle. Another time. Another moment where he had arrived, just a little too late. Flames. Smoke. A voice he couldn't forget. He shut it down instantly. Forced it away. Not here. Not now. Not again. He stepped forward. Raised the tool. And drove it into the rear window with everything he had. The glass exploded outward, shards scattering into the river, the sound sharp and violent, but gone almost immediately under the roar of the current. Water rushed in harder now. Faster. The interior collapsing into chaos as the pressure changed. The dog reacted instantly, but not in fear. It moved forward. Toward him. Daniel reached inside, the cold hitting harder now, biting into his arms as the current pushed through the broken window, fighting him, resisting him, trying to take control of the space. His hand found the dog's collar. Solid. Strong. Still there. Got you, he muttered. But the moment he pulled, something resisted. The dog didn't come free. Daniel frowned, adjusting his grip, pulling harder. Still stuck. His eyes dropped for a split second. And that's when he saw it. The leash. Wrapped tight. Caught in the twisted metal of the seat frame. Pinned. Trapping the dog in place. The water surged higher. Now reaching the dog's mouth. Time was gone. Completely gone. Daniel's grip tightened. And for the first time since he stepped into that river, he realized something. This wasn't just a rescue anymore. This was a race. Between him and the river that had already decided. This car wasn't coming back out. And neither was anything inside it. Unless he did something, right now. And fast. The river didn't slow, it didn't hesitate, it didn't care that there was still life trapped inside that sinking shell of metal, it just kept pulling, inch by inch, tightening its grip like something alive, something patient, something that had already decided the outcome long before Daniel Hale ever stepped into the water, and as the current surged harder against his legs, threatening to take his balance, he realized with brutal clarity that this wasn't just about strength anymore. This was about time, and time was already running out. The water had reached the dog's jaw now, splashing into its mouth every time the current shifted, forcing it to lift higher, straining, its muscles trembling under the effort, but still it didn't panic, still it didn't thrash or lose control. It held, steady, focused, its eyes locked on Daniel with something that made his chest tighten in a way he hadn't felt in years, not fear, not urgency, but something deeper. Trust, and that was the part that hit hardest, because this animal didn't know him, didn't owe him anything, and yet it wasn't fighting him, wasn't resisting, it was waiting, as if it believed he would get it out. Daniel's grip on the collar tightened, his other hand diving back into the freezing water, searching blindly along the seat frame, feeling twisted metal, torn fabric, debris shifting violently with the current, until his fingers finally brushed against it, the leash, pulled tight, wedged deep between bent steel and broken plastic, pinned in a way that wouldn't give easily, wouldn't release without a fight. Damn it, he muttered under his breath, his teeth clenching as he adjusted his position, forcing his body deeper into the vehicle, the cold swallowing his arms completely now, numbing his fingers almost instantly, making fine movement harder, slower, more dangerous, but he didn't stop, couldn't stop, because stopping meant losing this moment, and losing this moment meant losing the dog. Another surge hit the car, stronger this time, the entire frame shifting downward another inch, the back end dipping lower, the water rising faster inside, and Daniel felt it, that shift, that warning, the silent signal that the vehicle wasn't stable anymore, that it was about to go completely, and when it did, there would be no second chance. He leaned further in, ignoring the way the current pressed against his chest now, threatening to force him under, his boots struggling to find grip on the unstable riverbed, and he forced his hand deeper into the wreckage, fingers searching, pulling, testing the tension on the leash, trying to find a way to free it without losing the only hold he had on the dog. It wouldn't move. Not enough. Not fast enough. Daniel's mind shifted gears instantly, abandoning one approach, searching for another, because adaptability was survival, because in situations like this, the plan that didn't work wasn't the one you kept trying, it was the one you replaced. He released the collar for just a fraction of a second, long enough to grab the leash itself, pulling it taut, following its line to the exact point where it was trapped, and when his fingers found it again, he didn't try to pull anymore. He reached for the knife. It came free in one smooth motion, the blade already open before his mind fully registered the action, muscle memory taking over, guiding him the way it always had when time disappeared and only movement remained. The water surged again, harder now, splashing over the dog's head for a brief second before it forced itself back up, coughing slightly, but still holding, still fighting, still there. "Stay with me," Daniel said, louder now, though he knew the river would swallow most of it, but the words weren't for the dog anymore, they were for himself, a way to anchor the moment, to cut through the noise, to stay locked into the task. He drove the blade into the leash. The first cut didn't go through. The material was thick, soaked, stretched tight under pressure, resisting just enough to steal precious seconds. Daniel adjusted his grip, pushing harder, sawing through it with controlled force, ignoring the way his hands were starting to lose feeling, ignoring the way the current was pulling harder at his legs, threatening to knock him off balance. Another shift. The car dropped again. This time deeper. The back end dipping sharply, the window lying nearly level with the water now, and Daniel felt the urgency spike into something sharper, something closer to desperation, because he knew what came next. Once the rear submerged completely, it was over. The blade cut through. The leash snapped free. Daniel dropped the knife instantly, his hand shooting back to the collar, gripping it tight, pulling with everything he had, and this time, it moved. The dog surged forward with him, its body slipping free from the trap, water rushing around it as it came through the broken window, its weight hitting Daniel harder than expected as both of them struggled against the current for control. For a split second, the river almost won. Daniel's footing slipped, his body tilting sideways as the current slammed into him, trying to drag both of them down, the dog's weight shifting unpredictably as it fought to stay above water, and in that moment, everything balanced on the edge. One mistake. One wrong shift. And they would both go under. Daniel planted his foot hard, finding purchase on something solid beneath the mud, forcing his body upright, tightening his grip on the collar, pulling the dog closer, controlling its movement just enough to stabilize both of them. "Easy, easy," he muttered, more to steady himself than anything else. The dog didn't fight him. Didn't thrash. It adjusted. Moved with him. Trusted him. And made all the difference. Behind them, the car gave a final, heavy shift. Daniel turned his head just enough to see it. The rear dipped fully beneath the surface, the last visible part of the vehicle disappearing into the dark water as the river claimed it completely, the headlights flickering once more beneath the surface, and then going out. Gone. Just like that. Daniel didn't watch any longer. He couldn't. Because now the focus had shifted. From rescue to survival. He tightened his grip on the dog and started moving back toward the bank, each step a fight against the current, each movement calculated, controlled, because now the river was. He dropped to one knee, releasing his grip slowly, his chest rising and falling hard now as the adrenaline began to shift, to settle, to leave behind something else in its place. The dog stood beside him. Breathing hard. Shaking water from its coat. But alive. Still alive. Daniel looked at it for the first time without urgency clouding his vision, really looked, taking in the details he hadn't had time to notice before. The size. Larger than average. Strong build, but lean, ribs faintly visible beneath the soaked fur. Cuts along its shoulder. One ear slightly torn. Old scars mixed with fresh ones. This wasn't just a pet. This was a survivor. The dog looked back at him. Not with fear. Not with confusion. But with something steady. Something aware. Something that made Daniel pause for just a second longer than he expected. Because in that look, there was something else. Something he hadn't anticipated. Recognition. And before he could fully process that thought, the dog turned. Took a step away from him. Then another. Stopping just long enough to look back over its shoulder. And then it moved. Not running. Not fleeing. Leading. Straight toward the forest beyond the river. And that's when Daniel realized, this rescue wasn't over. Not even close. Daniel Hale stayed on one knee for a single breath after the dog pulled away, water dripping from his sleeves, mud clinging to his hands, cold settling into his bones now that the immediate violence of the river was behind him. And under any sane logic, under the rules he had built his life around since walking away from the military, that should have been the end of it. He had seen a trapped animal. He had gone in. He had pulled it out. That was already more than most men would have done in a flooded valley after 3 days of storm and collapsed roads and a river still angry enough to kill anything careless enough to challenge it. He could have stood up, gone back to his truck, turned the heat on full, and driven away with the cold shaking out of his muscles 1 mile at a time. He could have told himself the dog would find its way home, or that home no longer existed but still wasn't his responsibility, and he could have almost believed it, because almost believing things had become a survival skill long before solitude did. But then the German Shepherd stopped at the edge of the tree line, turned back, and stared at him with the same impossible steadiness it had held inside the sinking car. And in that look there was no confusion, no wild animal instinct telling it to flee, no dazed relief after being dragged from death. There was intention. The dog wasn't leaving him behind. It was waiting for him to move. Daniel slowly stood, one hand pressing against his thigh for balance as the ache in his knees and lower back announced itself all at once. His body still obeyed, but it never let him forget the years anymore, not the years in service, not the years after, not the quiet wear that came from carrying things no one else could see. He glanced back toward the river. The surface where the car had disappeared was already smoothing over, swallowing the event with terrible efficiency, as though the water intended to erase every sign that anything had happened there at all. Only a few bubbles rose through the dark current, then even those were gone. Daniel looked again at the dog. "You've got somewhere to be," he said under his breath, the words ghosting white in the damp cold air. The German Shepherd held his gaze for half a second longer, then turned and stepped into the trees. Daniel swore softly, not with anger, more with the resignation of a man who recognized a trap he was choosing anyway. He trudged back up the muddy slope to his truck, grabbed the emergency blanket, a dry jacket, a medical pouch, a flashlight, and the small field pack he kept behind the seat because old habits never died, they just got folded into quieter lives. By the time he slammed the truck door shut again, the dog had not disappeared. It stood 20 yards into the forest, visible between the trunks, waiting with an odd, tense patience that made the skin along Daniel's shoulders tighten. The air under the trees felt colder than it had by the river, and the smell changed too. Wet soil. Pine resin. Torn bark. Floodwater. And something fainter beneath it all, something metallic and stale. Daniel shrugged into the dry jacket while walking, stuffing the emergency blanket into the pack and tightening the straps with quick, practiced motions. The German Shepherd moved only when he crossed the first line of trees, flowing ahead over the soaked ground with that same quiet purpose, glancing back just often enough to make sure he was still coming. It was not random movement. Daniel knew random movement. He knew panic and confusion and the blind erratic patterns of living things driven by fear. This was not that. This was guidance. The storm had broken the forest into a maze of fallen limbs and uprooted trunks, and within 50 yards the path ceased to be anything a normal person would willingly follow. Branches lay in tangled piles higher than his waist. Sections of the slope had sheared away in slick ribbons of mud. A cedar had toppled across a shallow ravine, its root mass lifted out of the ground like the exposed ribs of some buried giant. The dog moved through it as if born to it, choosing narrow openings, doubling back when Daniel was forced to detour, never wandering so far ahead that he lost sight of the wet dark arc of its back. Daniel moved more slowly, reading the terrain the way he had once read streets, rooftops, compounds, shorelines, every step chosen rather than taken, each shift in earth weighed before his boot committed to it. He was still cold, but work began to heat him from the inside, and with the heat came memory, because the body did not separate strain from history. There were other wet forests in his mind. Other missions where the rain had seemed endless and the mud had sucked at boots while men ahead of him vanished into green darkness and the radio hissed with names he still heard in the small hours of the night. He pushed the thoughts down the same way he always did, not because he had mastered them, but because they were useless right now. The dog cut left along a narrow rise. Daniel followed and nearly missed the first sign because the storm had done such a good job of disrupting everything. A length of bright blue nylon caught on a broken branch, fluttering weakly in the wind. Not natural. Not old enough to be weathered. He stopped and touched it. Still wet from recent exposure, maybe from the storm, maybe after. He looked ahead. The German Shepherd had stopped again, watching him. "You came from somewhere," Daniel said quietly. "And you want me there." The dog gave a single impatient flick of its ears and moved on. 20 minutes later the signs multiplied. A partial boot print at the edge of a mudslide, half washed out but visible enough to tell him it was not his. A dent in the moss where something heavy had been dragged or carried. A deep scrape across stone at knee height, as if metal or plastic had been hauled through too tight a gap. Daniel crouched beside each one, the old calculating part of his mind reassembling a pattern from fragments. Someone had come through here during or after the storm. Someone human. The thought should have sent him back, should have drawn a hard line under this whole thing, because other people meant complications and complications meant choices and choices were exactly what he had come to these mountains to escape. He lived alone for a reason. His cabin sat 20 miles from the nearest town for a reason. The nearest neighbor was seasonal and gone half the year, and Daniel preferred it that way because silence made fewer demands than people did. But he kept going. The dog led him down into a narrow wash where storm water still streamed shallow and fast over stone. The air cooled further there, trapped by the banks, and the metallic scent sharpened enough to stop him in his tracks. Blood. Not fresh enough to be bright in the air, but unmistakable. Daniel's head lifted slowly. The German Shepherd stood 10 yards ahead, motionless except for the rise and fall of its chest. "How bad?" he murmured, and hated the question the second it left his mouth because he already knew he was past the point where turning away would feel clean. The wash opened into a small clearing where the storm had blasted a ring of trees apart and left the ground littered with splintered wood and branches. Something white gleamed among the debris. Daniel approached carefully, his shoulders tight, and unconsciously near the knife sheathed at his belt. It was the side panel of a pet crate, cracked almost in half, lodged beneath a fallen limb. Beside it lay a chewed nylon strap and a section of black harness with one buckle missing. The dog went straight to the harness, lowered its head, and touched it once with its nose. Daniel felt a quiet weight settle into his stomach. "You were in the car," he said, piecing it together. "Or with whoever was in it." The German Shepherd looked up. In its eyes he saw the same terrible combination he had seen in men after ambushes, after blasts, after impossible nights, exhaustion and refusal occupying the same space. Daniel checked the ground around the crate panel and found more. A heel mark driven deep into the mud. Another footprint angled sideways, as if whoever made it had slipped while carrying something or someone. Drops of blood on a shard of bark. Small. Not a pool. Not a kill site. Movement blood. His pulse changed then, not faster, but narrower, everything in him drawing inward toward a hard center. He had spent years training himself to move toward patterns like this without emotion, to assess first and feel later if there was time. But emotion was already there, because the dog had looked back from a sinking car instead of running, because it had chosen him, because somewhere ahead there might still be a human being alive enough to need that choice to matter. He rose and scanned the trees. "All right," he said. "Show me." The German Shepherd turned and pushed deeper into the forest, climbing now. The terrain steepened fast, the ground slick with wet pine needles and loose stone. Daniel grabbed branches to steady himself, boots sliding more than once, his breath deepening as the elevation forced more out of him. The dog seemed tireless, though Daniel knew that was an illusion. A soaked dog with fresh scrapes and a near drowning should have been spent. Adrenaline was moving it now. Instinct. Loyalty. Desperation. He recognized those fuels. They burned hot and borrowed against tomorrow. The storm had dragged a curtain of cloud low across the mountains, dimming the afternoon into something closer to evening. Under that grey light the woods took on a bruised, unreal quality. Water dripped steadily from every needle and leaf. Far off, a tree cracked and fell with a sound like a gunshot muffled by distance. Daniel did not startle. He had been away from war too long to confuse every sharp noise with danger, but not long enough to trust the forest blindly either. When the dog halted the second time, Daniel nearly walked past it. He followed its line of sight and saw nothing at first. Then the outline resolved through the brush, a trail. Not an official one, not marked, just a narrow path worn by occasional use, descending toward a lower section of land near the old reservoir flats where the river spread wider before rejoining the main channel. Daniel frowned. There were no houses out this way. No cabins he knew of except a hunting shack long collapsed years earlier. The dog took the path without hesitation. Daniel followed, and as he descended he noticed more evidence that someone else had used it recently. Branches broken chest high. A kneecap half buried in mud, waterlogged and torn. A child's sneaker lodged against a root. He bent and picked it up. Small. Pink stripe along the sole. Mud caked inside. He stared at it longer than he meant to. Something cold moved through him that had nothing to do with the weather. "No," he said very softly to no one at all, not as denial, but as command, as if sheer refusal could alter whatever waited at the bottom of that path. The German Shepherd whined then, the first sound from it beyond barking, and the noise cut through him with a strange intimacy, because it was not the wild cry of an animal in pain. It was worry. He pushed faster. The path bent around a stand of pines and opened onto a strip of soggy ground near the flooded flats. What had once been a rough parking area for fishermen was now half underwater, a mirror of dull grey broken by reeds, floating branches, and patches of churned mud. And there, under the leaning shadow of a cottonwood with half its roots exposed, stood a battered red pickup truck with the driver's door open and the rear passenger window broken from the inside out. Daniel stopped. For a second the scene aligned with the car at the river in a way that made the entire day feel like part of a single, darker sequence. The German Shepherd ran to the truck, circling once before stopping at the open driver's side and looking back at him. Daniel approached slowly. The front seat was empty. Rain had soaked the interior. On the floorboard lay a flashlight, a child's coloring book swollen with water, and a brown leather wallet opened as if dropped in haste. He picked it up, thumbing carefully through the ruined contents. Driver's license. County address from 2 towns over. Name, Mark Renner. Daniel filed it away. The back seat held a tangled blanket, a first aid kit ripped open, and a scattering of dog hair across the torn upholstery. Fresh blood marked the edge of the seat in a rust-dark smear trailing down toward the floor. Human? Animal? Too little to know. He looked at the dog. Your people? The German Shepherd stared back, then turned and trotted away from the truck toward the trees beyond the flats, pausing after a few yards. Daniel hesitated. Something in him was resisting harder now, not because he doubted the need, but because the shape of it had become too clear. This was not a simple rescue. Somewhere ahead there was an event with layers: the submerged car, the broken crate, the blood, the child's shoe, the empty truck. And events with layers rarely ended clean. He knew that from bitter experience. The last operation of his career had also begun with too few facts and too much urgency. By the time it ended, 3 men were dead, one of them his closest friend, and Daniel was alive in the technical sense only. The medal they pinned to him later felt obscene. He had left the teams within a year. Now, standing in the flooded flats with a stranger's wallet in his hand and a rescued dog waiting ahead, he felt that old pull of dread in his chest, the one that said the day was turning toward something irreversible. He shoved the wallet into his jacket pocket and followed. The woods on the far side of the flats were denser, older, the trunks wider and the undergrowth sparse enough to make visibility better but movement eerier. The dog no longer checked back as often. It seemed more certain here, angling through the trees with increasing urgency. Daniel's boots sank into leaf mold and hidden mud pockets. Once he stepped into water up to mid-calf where the storm had created a pool beneath the litter of last year's leaves. He came out soaked again, breath tightening with cold, but did not slow. He was close now. He could feel it. The forest carried a different silence here, not emptiness, but aftermath. Then the dog stopped so suddenly that Daniel nearly collided with it. Ahead, beyond a curtain of saplings, stood a small cabin he had never seen before. Not a true cabin even, more a utility shack or seasonal structure, weathered to grey, roof sagging slightly on one side, the porch half collapsed under a fallen birch. One window was broken. The front door hung open 6 inches, moving faintly in the wind. Daniel's senses sharpened at once, every old instinct rising without permission. Unknown structure. Possible occupants. Unknown threat. Blood trail leading in this direction. He crouched slightly, scanning for movement, listening. At first there was only the soft hiss of rain through needles and the drip from the eaves. Then, from inside the shack, something scraped weakly across wood. Daniel's eyes lifted. The German Shepherd's ears came up, body going rigid, not with aggression now, but recognition. Someone's in there, Daniel said, and his own voice sounded farther away than it should have. He approached the porch carefully, favoring the intact boards by instinct, though half the structure looked ready to collapse under less weight than his. The dog slipped past him and went through the open door. Daniel followed, every muscle braced. The interior smelled of wet wood, mold, blood, and fear. Light filtered in through the broken window and the gap in the door, painting dull silver shapes across a room barely larger than a tool shed. A camp cot stood against one wall. Shelves held rusted cans, a lantern, 2 mason jars full of screws. An overturned chair lay near the center of the room. And in the far corner, wrapped in a soaked blanket with one hand still clutching the broken handle of a flare gun, sat a woman with blood on the side of her face and a little girl pressed against her chest. The woman tried to raise the flare gun when Daniel entered, but her arm shook too violently to aim it, and the girl's eyes, too big, too pale with shock, lifted to him through strands of wet hair with the look of someone who had already seen too much. The German Shepherd crossed the room in 2 strides and shoved its head against the girl's knees. The child made a sound that was almost a sob and buried one hand in the dog's neck. Daniel stopped dead, his entire body caught between motion and stillness, because for one brief, devastating instant he was somewhere else entirely, another hostage room, another terrified civilian, another impossible minute where deciding wrong cost everything. Then the woman spoke, her voice hoarse and broken. "If you're with them," she said, "just do it fast. Daniel looked from her bleeding temple to the child to the dog leaning into them with total loyalty, and knew with absolute certainty that whatever had begun at the river was only the edge of something much darker. He lifted both hands slowly, empty, and took one careful step forward. "I'm not with anybody," he said. "But whoever they are, you need to tell me now, because they may already be coming." The words didn't settle easily in the small shack. They hung there, heavy, uncertain, like everything else inside that room had been forced into survival mode and no longer trusted anything at face value, and Daniel Hale could see it in the woman's eyes, that fragile line between belief and disbelief, the calculation happening even through the pain, even through the blood still slowly running down the side of her face and drying into the dirt on her skin. The little girl didn't look at him the same way. She looked at the dog. Her fingers buried deep in the German Shepherd's soaked fur, holding on with quiet desperation, like that connection mattered more than anything Daniel could say. And maybe it did. The dog pressed closer, its body angled protectively between the girl and the open space of the room, ears forward, posture alert, but not aggressive, not yet, not unless it needed to be. Daniel lowered himself slowly, not fully crouching, but enough to reduce his presence, to make himself less of a threat, his hands still open, visible, deliberate. "You're hurt," he said to the woman, his voice steady, controlled, not soft but not sharp either, the same tone he had used in situations where panic could get people killed. She didn't answer right away. Her grip on the flare gun tightened slightly, though her arm trembled too much to hold it steady. "Where's Mark?" she asked instead, her voice cracking at the name like it was the only thing holding her together. Daniel didn't answer immediately. He didn't lie either. "I found a truck," he said carefully. "Red pickup. Driver's door open. No one inside." The silence that followed was worse than any sound. The woman's face shifted, not dramatically, not with tears or collapse, just a small tightening around the eyes, a quiet understanding settling in that didn't need to be spoken out loud. The girl buried her face deeper into the dog's neck, as if she already knew. "They came after us," the woman said finally, her voice low, fragile but holding. "We thought the storm would slow them down, we thought we could get away." Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. "Who?" The woman swallowed, her breathing uneven. "Men from the quarry. They found something Mark took. Something he shouldn't have." Daniel felt the shift in the room again, subtle but undeniable. This wasn't random. This wasn't just a family caught in a storm. This was something else. Something with intent. "What did he take?" he asked. The woman hesitated, her eyes flicking briefly to the girl, then back to Daniel. "Documents," she said. "Files, records. Proof of what they've been dumping out there. Chemicals. Waste. People got sick. Kids got sick. Mark was going to take it to the state." Daniel exhaled slowly. Of course. It always came back to something like this. Greed. Cover-ups. People who believed they were untouchable because no one pushed back hard enough. "And they found out," Daniel said. It wasn't a question. The woman nodded weakly. "They came to the house. We ran. Took the truck. Molly was already in the back, we didn't have time to get her out of the crate." The dog's ears flicked at its name, but it didn't move, staying anchored to the girl. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. The crate. The broken panel. It all fit now. "The car in the river?" he asked. "We tried to cross before the water got too high," the woman said. "We didn't make it." Her voice broke slightly on the last word, but she forced it back under control. "Mark got us out. He told us to run. He went back for something in the truck." Daniel already knew what that meant. The timeline was closing in his head, pieces locking into place with cold precision. "And you came here," he said. "We thought it was abandoned," she whispered. "We thought we could hide until morning." Daniel glanced at the door. It was still slightly open, moving faintly with the wind. Too exposed. Too obvious. He didn't like it. Not at all. "How long have you been here?" he asked. Since last night, she said. We heard them once, out there, moving through the trees. The dog stiffened slightly at that, its head lifting, ears angling toward the forest outside. Daniel noticed immediately. You hear them now? He asked quietly. The German Shepherd didn't bark. Didn't growl. But its entire posture shifted. Alert. Focused. Listening. Daniel's chest tightened slightly. He stood slowly, moving toward the doorway, his body aligning instinctively, his senses sharpening, scanning the tree line beyond the clearing. The forest looked still. Too still. The kind of stillness that didn't belong after a storm. No birds. No movement. Just the faint sound of wind moving through broken branches. Then, something else. A snap. Distant. But deliberate. Daniel didn't move for a second. He didn't need to. He already knew. They are here, he said quietly. Behind him, the woman's breath hitched. The girl didn't look up, but her grip on the dog tightened. The German Shepherd stepped forward slightly, positioning itself between the door and the two of them, its body low, ready. Daniel's hand moved to his sidearm, not drawing it yet, but resting there, ready if needed. How many? He asked. 4, maybe 5, the woman said, her voice barely above a whisper now. Daniel nodded once, his eyes still on the tree line. He counted the angles. The entry points. The cover. The weaknesses of the structure. The fact that this shack wouldn't hold if things turned bad. And they would turn bad. He could feel it already. Listen to me, he said, turning back toward them, his voice steady, controlled, leaving no room for doubt. If they come in here, you stay down. You don't move unless I tell you. The woman stared at him, fear and something else mixing in her expression. You going to fight them? Daniel met her gaze. I'm going to make sure you and your daughter get out of here. The dog looked at him then. Directly. And in that look, something shifted again. Not just recognition this time. Alignment. As if it understood the role he was stepping into. As if it accepted it. Outside, another sound. Closer now. Footsteps. Slow. Careful. Hunting. Daniel's grip tightened slightly. His breathing steadied. The old part of him, the part he had tried to leave behind, was fully awake now. And it wasn't going anywhere. Not this time. Not when it mattered. The door creaked slightly as the wind pushed it open another inch. And just beyond the edge of the frame. A shadow moved. The shadow didn't rush the doorway, it lingered just beyond it, stretching long and thin across the warped wooden floor as if whoever cast it understood exactly how to use silence as a weapon, and Daniel Hale felt that immediately, the way tension could be built without a single word spoken, the way presence alone could shift the air in a room until it felt heavier, harder to breathe, harder to think, and that told him something important before anything else happened. These weren't reckless men, they weren't storm-chasing opportunists, they were controlled, patient, and used to getting what they came for. Daniel stepped slightly to the side of the doorframe, angling his body so he could see without fully exposing himself, his hand now resting firmly on the grip of his weapon, not drawing yet, not escalating until it was necessary, because escalation was a line you didn't cross unless you were ready to finish what came after. The German Shepherd mirrored him without needing instruction, shifting its position just enough to maintain a clear line between the doorway and the girl, its body low, muscles tight beneath soaked fur, eyes fixed on the opening with unwavering focus. The woman tried to stay still, but Daniel could see the tremor in her shoulders, the way her breathing fought against fear, and the girl didn't move at all, her face buried against the dog's neck, holding on like it was the only thing keeping her anchored in a world that had already taken too much from her in too little time. The wind pushed the door again, opening it slightly wider, and this time the shadow resolved into something more solid, a boot, dark, mud-streaked, stepping just into view. Then a voice. Calm. Almost conversational. We know you're in there. Daniel's eyes didn't leave the doorway. He didn't answer. Not yet. The voice continued, slightly louder now, but still controlled. You don't have to make this harder than it needs to be. Daniel exhaled slowly through his nose, his mind already mapping the tone, the cadence, the intention behind the words. This was the leader. Or at least someone confident enough to speak for the group. You've got something that doesn't belong to you, the voice said. We'd like it back. Daniel shifted his stance slightly, just enough to improve his angle. You're talking to the wrong person, he replied, his voice steady, carrying just enough edge to make it clear he wasn't someone easily intimidated. A brief pause followed. Then a soft chuckle. I don't think I am. The man stepped further into view, not fully inside the shack, but enough for Daniel to see him clearly now. Mid-40s, rough face, unshaven, eyes sharp and cold in a way that didn't come from emotion but from the absence of it. He wasn't holding his weapon raised, but it was there, slung low, accessible, ready. Behind him, Daniel caught glimpses of movement, at least 3 others, spread out, covering angles. Smart. Controlled. Dangerous. You're not from around here, the man said, studying Daniel with quiet interest. You don't look like someone who stumbled into this. Daniel didn't respond to that. He didn't confirm. Didn't deny. Silence was often more useful than words. The man nodded slightly, as if that told him everything he needed to know. Doesn't matter, he said. You're involved now. Daniel's grip tightened just slightly. Walk away, he said. The words were simple. Direct. But there was weight behind them. The kind of weight that came from experience, from knowing exactly what he was capable of if pushed. The man smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. You don't understand the situation, he said. That woman took something that can't leave this valley. Daniel didn't blink. Then you should have made sure she didn't get it in the first place. The smile faded. The air shifted again. Subtle. But real. The man's posture changed just enough to signal that the conversation was nearing its end. Last chance, he said quietly. Send her out. You walk away. This doesn't become your problem. Daniel didn't even look back at the woman. He didn't need to. The answer had already been decided the moment he stepped into the river. It already is, he said. The silence that followed was different. Heavier. Final. The man nodded once, almost respectfully, then stepped back out of the doorway. All right, he said. You made your choice. Daniel moved instantly. The moment the man disappeared from the frame, he shifted position, drawing his weapon smoothly, his body aligning with the doorway, his mind already running through the next sequence, the angles, the timing, the probability of entry points. Stay down, he said again, sharper this time, and behind him, he heard the woman pull the girl closer, heard the faint movement of fabric, the small, controlled sounds of people trying not to make noise. The dog didn't move from its position, but its entire body coiled tighter, ready. Outside, the forest came alive again, but not with chaos. With intent. Footsteps, repositioning, subtle but coordinated. They weren't rushing. They were setting up. Daniel's eyes tracked the edges of the doorway, the broken window, the weak points in the walls. He had maybe seconds before this turned. Then it happened. A sudden movement at the window, one of the men trying to peek inside. Daniel fired instantly. One shot. Clean. The glass shattered outward, the figure dropping back with a sharp curse, and the forest exploded into motion. Gunfire cracked through the trees, bullets tearing into the wooden walls, splintering boards, sending shards of wood flying through the air as the shack shook under the impact. The girl screamed. The woman pulled her down, shielding her as best she could. The German shepherd barked now, loud, fierce, stepping forward, teeth bared, ready to engage anything that came through that door. Daniel didn't fire blindly. He moved. Controlled. Precise. Each shot placed with intent, forcing the attackers to stay behind cover, disrupting their advance, buying time. But he knew the truth already. This structure wouldn't hold. Not against sustained fire. Not against men who knew how to apply pressure. This wasn't a defensive position. It was a temporary delay. And delays only worked if you had somewhere to go next. Another shot cracked through the wall inches from his shoulder, splintering wood, forcing him to shift position again. He dropped low, moving toward the back corner of the shack, his mind already searching, adapting, looking for an exit. Then he saw it. A rear door. Half hidden behind a stack of broken crates. Weak, but usable. Daniel glanced back at the woman. "We're not staying here," he said. Her eyes widened slightly. "Where do we go?" she asked. Daniel looked at the dog. Then back at the forest beyond the rear wall. "Away from them," he said. And as another round slammed into the front of the shack, splintering the doorway further, one thing became clear with absolute certainty. This wasn't going to end in that room. And getting out was about to be the hardest part. The shack wasn't just taking fire anymore, it was unraveling, every impact tearing pieces of it away, every shot weakening what little protection it offered, and Daniel Hale felt the structure shift beneath that pressure in a way that told him they were seconds away from losing any advantage they had left. He didn't waste time thinking about whether he could hold them off longer, because that wasn't the question anymore. The question was how fast he could get them out before the men outside decided to stop playing angles and simply walk through the front door. "Move," Daniel said sharply, already stepping toward the back, clearing the crates with one swift motion, revealing the rear door fully. It was old, warped, barely holding to its hinges, but it opened when he shoved it, the wood groaning as it gave way into the dark forest beyond. Cold air rushed in, carrying the scent of wet earth and something else now, gunpowder, sharp and unmistakable. Behind him, the woman struggled to stand, her movements slowed by pain, her balance unsteady as she tried to keep hold of her daughter. The girl clung tightly, her small hands gripping her mother's jacket, her face pale but silent now, fear locking her voice away. The German Shepherd didn't wait for instruction. It moved to the rear opening, scanning the outside, its body angled outward, ready to intercept anything that came too close. Daniel turned back just long enough to assess them both, his mind calculating quickly. The woman was injured, bleeding more than she was letting on. She wouldn't keep up at full speed. The girl could barely stand on her own. This wasn't going to be a clean escape. "Listen," Daniel said, his voice cutting through the chaos with absolute control. "You stay right behind me. You don't stop. You don't turn around. Understand?" The woman nodded, barely, but it was enough. Another round tore through the wall near the front, closer now, the attackers tightening their perimeter. They were preparing to push. Time was gone. Daniel stepped through the rear doorway first, weapon raised, scanning left, then right, his movements fluid, precise, clearing immediate space before signaling them forward. "Now," he said. The woman moved, pulling the girl with her, stumbling slightly as she crossed the threshold, but Daniel caught her arm briefly, steadying her, then releasing as soon as she regained balance. The dog stayed just ahead, guiding them into the trees, choosing a path that cut slightly uphill, away from the direct line of fire. Behind them, the shack took another hit, the sound of wood splitting louder now, heavier. Daniel didn't look back. He didn't need to. The moment they were 10 yards into the forest, he angled sharply right, breaking the expected path, forcing any pursuers to adjust their trajectory. "Keep moving," he said quietly, but firmly. The terrain was worse here, the storm having turned the forest floor into a patchwork of mud, fallen branches, and hidden drops that could twist an ankle or worse if misjudged. Daniel moved with controlled speed, choosing each step, each direction, not the fastest path, but the safest under pressure. The woman struggled behind him, her breathing becoming more labored with each step, but she didn't stop, didn't complain, her focus locked entirely on keeping the girl close. The German Shepherd stayed ahead, occasionally glancing back, adjusting its pace to match theirs, never straying too far, never losing them. Another sound broke through the forest. Not gunfire this time. Movement. Fast. Closing. Daniel's jaw tightened. They had split. Sent men around the back. He shifted direction again, cutting left now, heading toward denser cover, where visibility dropped but concealment increased. "They're flanking us," he said, more to himself than anyone else. The woman's breath hitched. "How far?" she asked. Daniel didn't answer. He didn't know exactly. But he knew it was close. Too close. A branch snapped somewhere behind them. Then another. Closer still. Daniel stopped abruptly, turning, raising his weapon, his eyes scanning through the trees. For a second, nothing moved. Then, there. A figure, partially visible between the trunks, moving fast, weapon up. Daniel fired once. The shot cracked through the forest, the figure dropping instantly behind cover, but the movement didn't stop. Another man appeared further left, trying to gain angle. Daniel shifted, firing again, forcing him back. "Go," he snapped, not taking his eyes off the threat. The woman didn't hesitate. She moved forward, pulling the girl with her, the dog staying close, guiding them deeper into the trees. Daniel held position for a few more seconds, firing controlled shots to keep the attackers pinned, then turned, moving quickly to catch up, his body falling back into rhythm, into motion, into something he hadn't felt in years but recognized instantly. This was no longer avoidance. No longer survival by distance. This was engagement. And he was fully in it now. The forest thickened ahead, the ground rising slightly, offering better cover but slower movement. Daniel caught up to them, placing himself between them and the direction of pursuit, his breathing steady despite the pace, his focus absolute. "We're heading for higher ground," he said. "Less angles. Better visibility." The woman nodded, though she was clearly reaching her limit. Blood had started to soak through the side of her jacket more visibly now, each step costing her more. Daniel saw it. Calculated it. Adjusted. He stepped closer, shifting the girl into his arms without asking, lifting her smoothly, her weight light but her presence heavy in a different way, a reminder of what was at stake now. The girl didn't resist. She simply held on. The dog moved closer, staying tight to Daniel's side now, its presence steady, protective, aware. Another shot cracked through the trees behind them, closer than before, the attackers gaining ground despite the terrain. Daniel pushed forward harder now, his pace increasing, his path more direct. The ridge wasn't far. If they reached it, they could break line of sight, force the men to slow, to reposition. It was their best chance. The trees began to thin slightly as they climbed, the ground firmer, less mud, more rock. Daniel's boots found better grip, his movement faster now, more controlled. The woman followed as best she could, her breathing ragged, but she didn't fall behind. Not yet. Then the dog stopped. Again. But this time, it didn't look back. It looked ahead. And growled. Low. Deep. Controlled. Daniel's eyes snapped forward. And that's when he saw them. 2 more men. Already on the ridge. Waiting. The trap had closed. And for the first time since stepping into the river, Daniel realized something had gone wrong. Very wrong. The moment Daniel Hale saw the 2 men already positioned on the ridge, everything inside him shifted, not into panic, not into fear, but into something colder, sharper, the kind of focus that stripped away hesitation completely, because traps only worked on people who reacted emotionally, and Daniel had spent too many years learning how to break those patterns. The men stood just high enough to hold advantage, silhouettes partially masked by broken trees and drifting mist, their weapons already up, not surprised, not rushed, which meant they had planned this, anticipated the escape route, calculated where Daniel would go before he even moved. That told him something important. These weren't just quarry workers trying to recover stolen documents. These were men who understood pursuit. Who understood containment. And that made them far more dangerous than anything else in this forest. The German shepherd's growl deepened, her body shifting slightly forward, positioning herself instinctively between the threat and the people behind her, not reckless, not charging, but ready to act the second it became necessary. Daniel lowered the girl carefully to her feet beside the woman, his movements quick but controlled, his mind already breaking the situation into pieces he could manage. "Stay behind that tree," he said, guiding them toward a thick trunk just off to the side, something solid enough to absorb rounds if it came to that. The woman didn't argue. She didn't hesitate. She moved, pulling her daughter close, both of them dropping low behind the tree as instructed, their breathing sharp but contained. Daniel stepped forward just enough to get a clearer line of sight, his weapon coming up smoothly, his eyes locking onto the two men ahead. "That's far enough," one of them called out, his voice carrying easily across the short distance, calm, controlled, confident. Daniel didn't respond immediately. He didn't need to. The man took another step forward, just enough to make himself more visible, his posture relaxed in a way that was almost deliberate, like he wanted Daniel to see that he wasn't under pressure. "You good?" the man said. "I'll give you that. But you're done." Daniel's grip didn't change. His breathing didn't shift. "Move," he said simply. The man smiled slightly. "Not how this works." The second man adjusted his position slightly, angling for a better line, his weapon tracking subtly, waiting for the right moment. Daniel saw it. Not just the movement, but the intention behind it. They were stalling. Waiting for the others to close in from behind. Completing the box. He didn't have time for conversation. He fired. One shot. Clean. Direct. The first man dropped instantly, the round catching him before he could react, his body collapsing backward down the slight incline. The second man fired in response, the shot snapping past Daniel's shoulder, close enough to feel the air move. Daniel shifted instantly, moving off his original line, returning fire, forcing the second man to break his position, diving behind cover as the forest erupted again into noise and motion. "Stay down!" Daniel shouted back toward the tree, though he knew they already were. The German shepherd didn't stay back. She moved. Fast. Low. Cutting across the ridge line, using terrain the way Daniel did, the way she had been doing since this began, her instincts aligning with his without needing instruction. The second man tried to track her, his weapon shifting, but Daniel didn't give him the time. Another shot. Then another. Each one forcing him to stay behind cover, to react instead of act. That was the difference. Control. You either had it, or you didn't. The sound of movement behind them grew louder now. The rest of the men were closing in. Daniel felt it in the rhythm of the forest, in the way the air shifted, in the subtle changes that most people would miss but he had been trained to read. They had seconds. Maybe less. The second man broke cover, trying to reposition, to get angle on Daniel's flank. That was his mistake. Molly hit him before he cleared the tree line. A blur of motion, controlled aggression, her body slamming into him with precision, not wild, not chaotic, but calculated, her weight driving him off balance, her jaws locking onto his arm just enough to disrupt his grip without tearing it apart. The weapon fell. The man hit the ground hard, struggling, trying to push her off, but she held, her stance solid, her focus absolute. Daniel closed the distance in 2 steps, his weapon trained, his voice cutting through the chaos again. "Don't move." The man froze. Not because he wanted to, but because he understood the position he was in. Daniel didn't waste time. He kicked the weapon further away, then stepped back slightly, creating space, maintaining control. Behind him, more movement. Closer now. The rest of them were almost here. "Molly," Daniel said. The dog released instantly, stepping back but staying ready, her eyes still locked on the man, her body coiled for another move if needed. Daniel looked at the ridge, then back toward the tree where the woman and girl were hidden. The situation had shifted again. Not better. Not worse. Just different. But one thing hadn't changed. They were still surrounded. And now, they were out of time. The sound of footsteps broke through the trees behind them, fast, aggressive, closing the final distance. Daniel exhaled slowly, his grip tightening just enough to remind himself of the moment, of the line he was about to cross. This wasn't avoidance anymore. This wasn't escape. This was a fight. And it wasn't ending here. Not if he had anything left to give. The forest didn't erupt into chaos this time, it tightened, like a fist closing, like everything was being drawn inward toward a single point, and Daniel Hale felt it immediately, that shift from scattered threat to coordinated pressure, the kind that didn't rely on noise or panic, but on timing, positioning, inevitability, and as the footsteps closed in from behind, he understood exactly what the men were doing now. They weren't chasing anymore, they were finishing. The man on the ground didn't move, not with Molly standing just a step away, her body still angled toward him, teeth barely visible, eyes locked, a silent warning that didn't need reinforcement, but Daniel didn't waste any more attention there, because that piece of the situation was contained, controlled, and everything else was not. He turned sharply, his body aligning toward the sound behind him, weapon raised, eyes cutting through the trees just as the first figure broke through the line of brush. Daniel fired instantly. One shot. Then another. The first man dropped hard, the second ducked behind cover, returning fire almost immediately, bullets tearing through bark and snapping branches as the forest exploded again into violence. "Stay down!" Daniel shouted without looking back, his voice sharp, commanding, and behind him he heard the faint shift of movement, the woman pulling her daughter tighter, both of them pressed against the tree, exactly where they needed to be. Molly moved again, not forward this time, but laterally, circling, her instincts guiding her into a position that gave her angle without exposure, her body low, silent, precise, working with Daniel in a way that no one had trained her to do, but she understood anyway. Another man appeared to Daniel's right, trying to flank, his weapon already coming up, but Daniel was faster. He shifted, fired once, forcing the man back behind cover, disrupting the angle before it could form. That was the key now. Disrupt. Delay. Survive. The shots from the left came next, sharper, closer, the attackers tightening their circle, reducing space, reducing options. Daniel dropped low, moving quickly to a new position, using the terrain, using the broken trees, the rocks, anything that gave him even a slight advantage. He didn't stay still. Never stayed still. Because stillness got you killed. The man Molly had taken down tried to move again, inching toward his weapon, but she reacted instantly, stepping forward, a low growl cutting through the noise, freezing him in place. Daniel didn't even look. He trusted her. Completely. And that trust was something he hadn't felt in a long time. "We move now," Daniel shouted, turning back toward the tree. The woman looked up, her face pale, her strength fading, but she nodded, pushing herself up, pulling the girl with her. Daniel moved to them immediately, grabbing the girl again, lifting her without hesitation, her arms wrapping around his neck, her body trembling but holding on. "Stay close," he said to the woman, his voice lower now but no less firm. She didn't respond. She just followed. Molly fell in beside them, her position shifting instantly from offense to protection, her body angled outward, covering their movement as Daniel began to push forward again, this time not toward the ridge, but across it, cutting diagonally, breaking the expected path completely. Another shot cracked through the trees behind them, closer than before, a bullet striking a rock just ahead, sending fragments into the air. Daniel adjusted instantly, shifting direction slightly, never stopping, never giving the attackers a clean line. The forest thickened again, the terrain uneven, forcing slower movement, but offering better concealment. Daniel used it, weaving through the trees, choosing paths that forced pursuit to slow, to think, to react instead of advance. But they were still coming. Still closing. He could hear it. Feel it. The pressure didn't ease. It built. Then something changed. The ground dropped. Suddenly. Sharply. Daniel skidded slightly as the terrain gave way into a narrow ravine, the slope steep, slick with mud and loose rock. He stopped just short of the edge, pulling back, adjusting his stance. The woman nearly collided with him, catching herself at the last second, her breath ragged now, her strength clearly failing. Molly moved to the edge, looking down, then back at Daniel. The ravine wasn't deep. But it was enough. Enough to break line of sight. Enough to disrupt pursuit. Enough to create space, if they moved fast enough. Daniel made the decision instantly. "We go down," he said. The woman hesitated for half a second, looking at the slope, then at him. "I can't," "You can," Daniel cut her off, not harsh, but absolute. You don't stop. Another shot cracked behind them. Closer. Daniel didn't wait for agreement. He shifted his grip on the girl, then stepped over the edge, sliding down the slope in a controlled descent, using his boots and free hand to manage speed, to maintain balance. The girl held on tightly, her face buried against his shoulder. Molly followed immediately, moving with far more control, her body adapting to the terrain effortlessly. Daniel reached the bottom, landing solidly, then turned, looking up. Come on, he called. The woman took a breath, then stepped forward, committing, sliding down after him, her descent less controlled, faster, but she made it, stumbling at the bottom but staying on her feet. Daniel caught her arm briefly, steadying her, then released. Move, he said again. They pushed forward along the ravine floor, the walls rising on either side, narrowing the space, but also blocking sight from above. The sound of movement behind them didn't stop. The attackers reached the edge seconds later. Daniel heard them. Saw the shadows shift above. One of them shouted something. Then, movement. They were coming down. Of course they were. Daniel's jaw tightened. The ravine wasn't escape. It was delay. But delay was still something. He pushed harder, his pace increasing despite the terrain, despite the weight, despite the exhaustion creeping in at the edges of his muscles. Molly stayed close, her presence steady, her awareness constant, her role now fully locked into his. They weren't just moving together anymore. They were working together. And somewhere ahead, there had to be a way out. There had to be something. Because behind them, the men were not stopping. And this was far from over. The ravine funneled sound in a way that made everything feel closer than it should have been, footsteps echoing off the narrow walls, loose stones skittering down from above as the men descended after them, and Daniel Hale knew they had traded distance for time, but time was bleeding out just as fast as the woman beside him. Her breathing had turned shallow, uneven, every step costing more than the last, and even without looking, Daniel could see the dark stain spreading along her side, the blood soaking through layers that were never meant to hold it back for this long. He adjusted his pace slightly, not slower, never slower, but more controlled, choosing ground that would keep her upright, keep her moving, because if she went down here, in this tight channel of rock and mud, there would be no clean way to get her back up before the men behind them closed the gap completely. The German shepherd moved ahead, then back again, her pattern shifting, checking the path, then checking them, her body language sharper now, more urgent, as if she could feel the narrowing window just as clearly as he could. Stay with me, Daniel said quietly, though the words were meant as much for the woman as they were for the dog, anchoring the moment, keeping everything from slipping into panic. The girl clung to him, silent, her small fingers locked into the fabric at his shoulder, her breathing fast but controlled, and he felt the weight of that trust more than anything else, the way she didn't question, didn't resist, just held on because there was nothing else left to hold. The ravine bent sharply to the right ahead, the walls closing in tighter for a stretch, forcing single-file movement, and Daniel's instincts flared immediately. Choke point. Limited mobility. High risk. But there was no alternative path. Not here. Not now. He pushed through it, shoulders brushing rock, boots slipping slightly on wet stone, then breaking through into a wider section where the ground leveled just enough to allow faster movement. For a moment, just a moment, the pressure behind them seemed to ease. The echoes shifted. The footsteps weren't as immediate. Daniel didn't trust it. He had learned long ago that moments like that weren't relief, they were transition. The dog stopped suddenly. Again. But this time the energy in her body was different. Not just alert. Alarmed. Her ears snapped forward, her stance tightening, her gaze locked ahead with a focus that cut through everything else. Daniel followed her line of sight. And saw it. The ravine didn't continue. Not the way they needed it to. It ended. Not completely, but enough. Ahead, the ground dropped away into a flooded basin where the stormwater had collected, turning the lower section into a wide, shallow pool that stretched across the path, blocking direct movement forward. The water wasn't calm. It moved slowly, swirling in places, deeper than it looked, dark enough to hide what lay beneath. Daniel stopped. Calculated. Distance across, maybe 30 yards. Depth, unknown. Speed of movement, slow. Exposure, high. And behind them, the men were closing again. The sound returned. Louder now. Closer. The woman staggered slightly, catching herself on the wall, her strength nearly gone. "I can't," she whispered. Daniel looked at the water. Then back at her. Then at the dog. The German shepherd stepped forward, approaching the edge of the basin, her nose lifting slightly, testing the air, then lowering toward the water, watching the movement, reading it in a way Daniel couldn't, but trusted anyway. She looked back at him. And in that look, there was no hesitation. Daniel exhaled slowly. "We cross," he said. The woman shook her head weakly. "It's too deep." Daniel stepped forward, testing the edge with his boot. The ground held. Barely. But it held. "It's deep enough," he said. "And it's the only way." Another shout echoed behind them. Closer now. They were almost here. The decision was already made. Daniel shifted the girl slightly, securing his hold, then stepped into the water. Cold. Immediate. Rising fast around his boots, his legs, pushing against him, not as violently as the river, but still strong enough to slow him, to force careful movement. He didn't rush. Couldn't rush. Every step had to be placed. Every shift controlled. Molly entered beside him, her movement smoother, her body adapting quickly, staying close, watching the path ahead. The woman followed, slower, struggling, but moving. The water reached Daniel's knees. Then higher. The current pulled slightly, uneven beneath the surface, threatening to shift his balance if he misjudged even once. Halfway across, the bottom dropped suddenly. Daniel felt it instantly, his foot losing solid ground, his body dipping deeper as the water surged up toward his waist, the cold biting harder now, sharper, stealing strength. He adjusted, shifting his weight, finding footing again, but the moment cost him time. Energy. And behind them, the men reached the edge. Daniel heard them. Saw them. Weapons raised. No more hesitation. Shots cracked across the water. Bullets striking the surface, sending sharp sprays upward, disrupting the calm, turning the crossing into chaos. Daniel didn't stop. Couldn't stop. He pushed forward, each step harder now, the water resisting more, the girl's weight shifting as she held tighter, the woman struggling behind him, her movement slower, weaker. Another shot. Closer. A bullet struck the water just inches from his leg, the spray cold against his skin. Molly moved faster, pushing ahead slightly, then turning back, her presence pulling them forward, guiding, urging. Daniel's jaw tightened. "Keep moving," he shouted back, though he didn't know if the woman had anything left to give. The far side wasn't far now. 10 yards. Maybe less. But it felt like miles. The water surged again, uneven, shifting beneath them, the footing unreliable, dangerous. The woman stumbled. Hard. Her body dipping into the water, her balance gone for a split second. Daniel turned instantly, catching her arm, pulling her upright, stabilizing her before she went under. "Stay with me," he said, his voice sharper now, cutting through everything else. She nodded weakly, barely conscious, but still there. Still fighting. The shots continued. The men advancing into the water now, slower, but relentless. They weren't stopping. They weren't turning back. This was the endgame for them. Daniel pushed harder. The water began to shallow. Slowly. Inch by inch. His boots finding firmer ground again. Then, finally, he stepped out. Onto solid earth. He didn't stop. He pulled forward, helping the woman out, dragging her the last few steps if necessary, until all of them were clear of the water, the basin behind them. Molly turned immediately, facing the direction they came from, her body low, ready again, buying them whatever seconds she could. Daniel set the girl down briefly, steadying her, then turned, raising his weapon once more. The men were halfway across now. Still coming. Still closing. Daniel exhaled slowly, his grip tightening. There was no more running. Not here. Not now. This was where it turned. And this time, he wasn't stepping away. The water behind them churned as the men pushed forward, slower now but still relentless, their silhouettes breaking through the grey surface like something that refused to be stopped, and Daniel Hale stood on the far edge of that flooded basin with the weight of everything settling into a single, sharp moment where there were no more directions left to run, no more terrain to use, no more distance to create, only a line drawn in mud and water and the quiet understanding that whatever happened next would decide everything. His breathing slowed, not because the danger had passed, but because it had reached its peak, and men like him were trained for exactly that moment, the one where chaos narrowed into clarity, where fear became focus, and action became inevitable. The girl stood behind him now, holding onto the German shepherd's neck, her small fingers gripping tightly, her face pale but no longer frozen, something else in her eyes now, trust, fragile but real, placed entirely on the man who had stepped into her world without hesitation. The woman struggled to stay upright, her strength nearly gone, her body leaning against the rough trunk of a tree at the edge of the clearing, her eyes half-lidded but still aware enough to understand what was happening, still holding on because her daughter was still standing. Molly stood between them and the basin, her body angled forward, her stance low and controlled, her gaze locked on the advancing men with an intensity that didn't belong to an animal reacting to fear, it belonged to something deeper, something that had chosen this moment just as much as Daniel had. The first man reached the edge of the water, stepping onto solid ground, his weapon already rising, his expression hard, focused, stripped of anything that wasn't purpose. Daniel didn't wait. He fired. One shot. Then another. The man dropped instantly, the impact stopping him mid-step, his body collapsing forward into the mud. The second man came up behind him, firing immediately, the shot snapping past Daniel's shoulder, close enough to feel, but not enough to matter. Daniel shifted, returning fire, forcing him back into partial cover, disrupting the advance before it could gain momentum. The third man moved wide, trying to flank, trying to break the line, but Molly reacted before Daniel even turned. She moved fast, cutting across the clearing, her body low and precise, intercepting the angle, forcing the man to adjust, to hesitate, to lose the advantage he had been about to create. Daniel saw it, used it, firing again, driving the man back toward the waterline. The fight wasn't chaotic. It wasn't wild. It was controlled, calculated, each movement carrying intent, each shot placed with purpose, because Daniel wasn't just reacting, he was dictating the pace now, forcing them into positions they didn't want, turning their numbers into something less effective by controlling the space. But they were still coming. Still pushing. The leader stepped forward last, emerging from the water with a calm that didn't match the situation, his weapon held steady, his eyes locked on Daniel with something that looked almost like recognition. "You don't have to die for this," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the short distance, even over the sound of water and breath and tension. Daniel didn't lower his weapon. "Neither do they," he replied. The man's expression didn't change. "That's already been decided." Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. "Not by you." The silence that followed lasted less than a second. Then it broke. The leader fired first. Daniel moved at the same time. The shot passed close, but Daniel was already shifting, returning fire, the impact forcing the man to step back, his balance shifting just enough to break his control. Molly lunged. Not blindly. Not recklessly. She timed it perfectly, hitting him from the side just as he tried to recover, her weight driving him down, her jaws locking onto his forearm, not tearing, not killing, but controlling, disabling. The weapon fell. The moment shifted. Completely. Daniel closed the distance in 2 steps, his weapon trained, his voice cutting through the moment with absolute finality. "It's over." The man on the ground didn't move. Didn't fight. Not because he couldn't, but because he understood. The others hesitated. Then one by one, they lowered their weapons. Not out of surrender. But out of calculation. Because the fight had turned. And they knew it. The forest fell quiet again. Not the unnatural silence from before, but something different. Something that felt like the end of pressure, the release of something that had been building for too long. Daniel lowered his weapon slowly, not fully, not yet, but enough to signal that the immediate threat had passed. Molly released her grip, stepping back but staying ready, her eyes still locked on the men, her body still coiled in case anything changed. The girl moved forward slowly, her hand still resting on Molly's back, her presence small but steady now, no longer frozen by fear, but grounded by something stronger. The woman slid down slightly against the tree, her strength finally giving out now that the moment had passed, but her eyes found Daniel's, and in that look, there was something he hadn't seen in a long time. Gratitude. Not loud. Not overwhelming. Just real. Hours later, when the sound of sirens finally cut through the forest, when law enforcement and rescue teams pushed through the broken terrain, when the men were taken into custody and the truth of what they had been protecting began to surface, Daniel stood at the edge of that same basin, the water calmer now, the storm finally breaking apart overhead, the clouds thinning just enough to let light through for the first time in days. The girl stood beside him. Molly between them. Always between them. Always present. Daniel looked down at the dog, at the animal that had pulled him back into something he had spent years avoiding, something he thought he had left behind completely. He knelt slowly, his hand resting against her neck, his fingers brushing through damp fur, feeling the steady warmth beneath it. "You knew," he said quietly. Molly didn't move. Didn't need to. Because the answer wasn't in sound. It was in presence. In everything that had led them here. The girl looked up at him, her voice soft but steady. "She didn't leave," she said. Daniel met her eyes. And for the first time in a long time, something inside him settled. Not fixed. Not erased. But changed. "No," he said quietly. She didn't. The wind moved through the trees, lighter now, carrying away what was left of the storm, and as the forest slowly returned to something resembling peace, Daniel Hale realized something he hadn't allowed himself to believe in for a very long time. Some things don't pull you under. Some things pull you back.